What happened to your eye? The question, thrown like a stone into the quiet opulence of the dining room, came from the man at the head of the table, Edward Grayson. It was not a question born of concern. It was a performance. If you believe that a person's true character is revealed, not in how they treat their equals, but those they believe are beneath them, subscribe now. You'll be part of a community that understands the stories hidden behind closed doors. The clinking of silverware against fine china faltered. A dozen pairs of eyes, belonging to bankers, investors, and the city's elite, swiveled from their host to follow his cold gaze. The target of his inquiry was not one of them. It was Laura Vega, the maid, a woman whose role was to be as invisible as the air they breathed. She stood frozen, a stack of porcelain plates in her hands, suddenly feeling as heavy as granite. Around her left eye, a grotesque bloom of purple and swollen blue marred her otherwise gentle features, a stark and violent painting on a canvas of quiet dignity. She kept her head bowed, her dark hair falling forward as if to shield her from the collective stare. She knew the rules of this house. You do not draw attention, you do not cause a scene, and you certainly do not exist as a person with problems of your own. Edward's question was a violation of all these rules, a deliberate act to remind everyone, including her, of the power he wielded. He could make anyone visible or invisible at his whim. "It was an accident, sir. I tripped on the stairs," Laura murmured. Her voice was a thin thread, easily broken, meant only for him but now amplified by the suffocating silence of the room. She prayed it would be enough, a simple lie to smooth over the disruption, to allow her to retreat back into the shadows where she belonged. But Edward was not looking for an easy resolution. He was enjoying the spectacle. "Tripped?" he echoed, a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor piercing the air. He leaned back in his chair, a king addressing his court, and gestured dismissively toward her. "That is what happens when one is not mindful. This home, these objects," he said, his hand sweeping to encompass the curated perfection of the room. "They demand a level of awareness that, regrettably, not everyone possesses." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A few of the guests offered tight, uncomfortable smiles. Others found a sudden, intense interest in the patterns of their dinner plates. Across the table, Edward's wife, Helen, remained perfectly still, her face a beautiful, unreadable mask. She was another exquisite object in his collection, and she knew better than to tarnish the display with an opinion. Laura felt a hot sting behind her injured eye, the threat of tears she refused to shed. Humiliation was a bitter pill, but one she had learned to swallow. Her daughter's school fees, the rent for their small apartment, the hope for a life beyond these polished walls, it all depended on this job. Her dignity was a luxury she could not afford. She offered the smallest of nods, a barely perceptible dip of her head. It was an admission of guilt for a crime she didn't commit, a gesture of submission meant to end the interrogation, but it only emboldened him. "Look at me when I am speaking to you." Edward's voice dropped, the feigned civility replaced by a low, menacing growl. Slowly, painfully, Laura lifted her head. She met his gaze for a single, searing second. There was nothing there. No empathy, no pity, just the flat, cold reflection of his own power. "Pathetic," he concluded. "Return to the kitchen. Have someone else finish clearing the table. I will not have you frightening my guests with your clumsiness." He waved her away as one might shoo an errant fly. As she turned and walked away, the weight of 24 judging eyes on her back, she felt a profound sense of shame, not for the bruise, but for the lie she had to tell to protect the man who gave it to her. No one at that table, least of all Edward himself, noticed the small figure standing just beyond the ornate archway of the dining room. 10-year-old Daniel Grayson had been watching the entire exchange. His small body was rigid, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. In a house of calculated transactions and emotional voids, Laura was the only person who offered him genuine warmth. She was the one who read to him when his parents were out, the one who made him hot chocolate after a nightmare, the one whose quiet presence was a constant, comforting light. He had seen his father's rages before, had heard the slammed doors and the shouted curses that echoed through the long, empty halls. He knew, with the unshakable certainty of a child who sees the truth plainly, that she had not tripped on any stairs. And as he watched her retreat, her shoulders slumped in defeat, a cold and unfamiliar fury began to burn in his chest, an anger that was a mirror of his father's, but aimed in the opposite direction. The world Edward had so carefully constructed, a world of absolute control, had just developed a fatal crack. He was so busy performing for his audience of sycophants that he failed to see the most important critic of all, his own son. The boy saw not a powerful master, but a cruel bully. Laura reached the sanctuary of the vast stainless steel kitchen, her composure finally crumbling. She leaned against a cool countertop, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled a bag of frozen peas from the freezer, the icy cold a small relief against the throbbing heat of her face. She closed her good eye, trying to will herself away, to a place where she was not an object of scorn, where her pain was her own. She just needed a moment, a single moment to piece herself back together before she had to face the other staff. A quiet sound broke the silence, the soft scuff of a small leather shoe on the marble floor. She opened her eye, startled. Daniel was standing in the doorway, his face a storm of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his gaze fixed on the ugly bruise. Then he walked purposefully toward her, his small form radiating an intensity that was startling. What was he going to do? In the vast, sterile silence of the kitchen, Daniel did not speak a word. He simply approached Laura, his small face a mask of grim determination. His eyes, the same chilling blue as his father's, were fixed on the makeshift compress of frozen peas she held to her face. It was a flimsy, pathetic defense against a pain he understood was more than skin deep. With a purpose that belied his 10 years, he walked to the industrial-sized freezer, his movements precise and economical. He pulled out a proper ice pack, wrapped it carefully in a soft blue dish towel, and returned to her side. Gently, his small hands surprisingly steady, he removed the bag of vegetables and replaced it with the cloth-wrapped ice, holding it himself against the swollen, discolored skin of her cheek. It was an act of such profound tenderness and quiet rebellion that it seemed to charge the very air in the room. In that moment, he was not a child. He was her protector, a silent guardian against the cruelty of his own blood. The sound of hearty laughter shattered the stillness. Edward Grayson swept into the kitchen, a portly investor in tow, the echo of a self-congratulatory joke still on his lips. The laughter died in his throat, choked off by the scene that confronted him. There was his son, his heir, a miniature version of himself in a bespoke suit, standing on a step stool to reach the face of the maid he had so publicly and viciously humiliated. The boy's loyalty was a tangible thing, a silent, damning indictment that hung in the air between them. The investor's smile faltered, his eyes darting from the father to the son, a flicker of confusion and then sharp, sudden interest on his face. Edward attempted to regain control, his voice a strained imitation of paternal authority. He commanded Daniel to stop, to leave the maid alone, insisting dismissively that she was perfectly fine. He tried to paint the scene as a childish fancy, a misunderstanding that could be swept away with a simple order. But Daniel did not move. He did not even flinch. He simply turned his head, his gaze meeting his father's across the gleaming marble island. Then his voice, clear and steady, cut through his father's blustering denials. He stated with the brutal simplicity that only a child possesses, that his father was a liar. He told the man who stood beside his father and the whole silent listening house that Laura had not tripped. The truth, once released, could not be recalled. The boy's voice, though barely above a whisper, filled every corner of the kitchen. He recounted the events of the previous evening in his father's study, the shouting into the telephone, the violent, frustrated sweep of an arm that sent a heavy, metal trophy flying across the room. He described the sickening thud as it ricocheted off the mahogany wall and struck Laura as she silently entered to collect a tray. He told them how she had crumpled, how she had insisted it was nothing, her only concern to not provoke his father's rage any further. And he told them the most damning detail of all, that his father, in his fury, had never even looked at her. An absolute deafening silence descended upon the kitchen. It was broken only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The investor's face had transformed. The polite interest was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, undisguised revulsion. He looked at Edward, truly looked at him, and saw not a captain of industry, but a petty tyrant who terrorized his staff and lied in front of his own child. A sickly, gray pallor spread across Edward's face. The carefully constructed facade of power and control shattered into a million pieces, a reflection of the man he was in the horrified eyes of his business partner. The investor took a deliberate step back, a physical separation from the toxicity he now witnessed. He shook his head slowly, his voice low and final. He informed Edward that he would be leaving, that their meeting for the following day was canceled. His company, he stated with chilling clarity, did not associate with men of Edward's character. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing Edward's ruin. Edward Grayson stood frozen, exposed and utterly annihilated, not by a market downturn or a corporate rival, but by a child's unwavering devotion to the truth. His son hadn't just revealed a secret. He had detonated the very foundation of his father's world. What, in the face of such complete moral devastation, could he possibly do next? The departure of the investor left a vacuum in the kitchen, a void that sucked all the air and warmth from the room. Edward remained motionless, a statue of a man whose pedestal had just crumbled beneath him. His face, once a mask of command, was now slack with the shock of utter exposure. He stared at his son, but his eyes seemed to look straight through him, seeing only the ghost of his own authority. The power he had cultivated his entire life, the fear he had wielded like a scepter, had been rendered useless by 10 years of innocence and a single, unvarnished truth. Daniel, for his part, did not waver. He continued to hold the ice pack against Laura's cheek, his small shoulders squared, a silent sentinel standing his ground. He had crossed a line, a point of no return, and in the chilling silence of the kitchen he seemed to grow older, the weight of his actions settling upon him not as a burden, but as a mantle. Laura was trapped between them, the unwilling epicenter of the earthquake that had just fractured the Grayson dynasty. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull throb of her injury. The son's defense was a heroic, beautiful thing, but the father's wrath, she knew, would be biblical. She expected an explosion, a torrent of rage that would scorch them all, but it never came. Edward simply turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. It was not a retreat, it was a collapse. The sound of his heavy, defeated footsteps fading down the marble hall was more terrifying than any shout could ever have been. The king had been dethroned, and the kingdom he left behind was now a strange and hostile territory. In the hours and days that followed, the very atmosphere of the mansion shifted. The air grew thick with unspoken words. The other staff members, who had undoubtedly heard the entire exchange, now moved around Laura with a new, cautious reverence. Their pity was replaced by a kind of fearful awe. She was no longer just one of them. She was the woman who had inadvertently brought the master of the house to his knees. They gave her a wide berth, their eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and terror, for they all knew that a wounded beast is the most dangerous kind. Edward became a phantom in his own home. He sequestered himself in his study, the heavy oak doors remaining closed. Meals were left untouched on trays outside his room. The roaring commands that once echoed through the halls were replaced by a dead, oppressive silence. This new quiet was far more unnerving than the noise had ever been. It was the quiet of a storm gathering strength just over the horizon. During this time, Daniel's self-appointed guardianship of Laura solidified. He would appear silently at her side as she worked, a small shadow ensuring her well-being. He would bring her a glass of water, or simply sit in the room while she dusted, his presence a quiet declaration that she was not alone. For Laura, his devotion was both a comfort and a source of profound anxiety. She was deeply grateful, but she also felt the terrifying weight of his sacrifice. She had become the wedge that had driven a son and his father apart, and she feared the final splintering blow that was yet to come. She tried to maintain a professional distance, to gently discourage his constant attention, but his loyalty was as fierce as it was silent. He had chosen his side, and he would not be moved. One evening, as Laura was tidying the deserted living room, long after the rest of the household had retired, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, expecting to see Daniel, but instead, it was Helen Grayson. Edward's wife stood there, a vision in silk, her face as serene and unreadable as ever. In the past, Helen had barely acknowledged Laura's existence, but now she looked at her with an unnerving, direct intensity. There was no anger in her eyes, no blame. There was something else, something cold and calculating. Helen glided forward, her movements fluid and silent. She stopped directly in front of Laura and extended a hand. In her palm lay a small, ornate key. It was not a key to any of the main rooms of the house. It was older, more intricate. Helen pressed the key into Laura's hand, her fingers cool against Laura's skin. The silent command was clear. "Take it." As Laura's fingers closed around the cold metal, Helen leaned in, her voice a barely audible whisper, so quiet it could have been the rustling of her gown. She spoke a single sentence, a statement that was both a revelation and a terrifying new command, before turning and disappearing as silently as she had arrived. Laura stood frozen, the key growing heavy in her palm. The words echoed in her mind, changing everything she thought she knew about the silent porcelain woman of the house. What door did this mysterious key unlock? The shock of seeing that name, a ghost from a past she had buried under years of pain and hard work, sent a jolt of ice through Laura's veins. For a moment, the library, the ledger, the mansion itself, all faded away, and she was back in that hospital room, the sterile smell of antiseptic in her nostrils, receiving the news that had shattered her world, the news that the man who had caused the devastating car crash, the man who had crippled her husband and saddled her with a mountain of debt, had simply vanished, his case dismissed for lack of evidence. It had never made sense. And now, the missing piece of that puzzle lay in her hands, written in the elegant, cruel script of Edward Grayson. It wasn't an accident. It was an acquisition. A life erased from a balance sheet. The realization didn't just bring her pain. It brought a terrifying, clarifying rage. Her fear, the constant gnawing companion of her life in this house, was burned away in an instant, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of purpose. Her movements became sharp, efficient. The trembling in her hand ceased. She carefully closed the ledger, slipped the fake book back into its place on the shelf, where it settled with a soft, final thud. The library was once again a perfect, undisturbed monument to Edward's power. But now she carried its darkest secret with her. She navigated the sleeping house not as a frightened mouse, but as a predator learning the layout of a new hunting ground. Back in the Spartan confines of her room, she lifted a loose floorboard beneath her narrow bed, a space where she kept the few sentimental items she owned. She wrapped the ledger in an old, soft scarf, her daughter's first, and laid it to rest in the dark, hidden hollow. It was a secret buried beneath a secret, a truth protected by love. The next morning, the sun rose on a different woman. Laura went about her duties with the same quiet diligence, but an invisible armor now encased her. When she served coffee, her hand was steady. When she cleared dishes, her eyes were direct. She no longer flinched from the shadows or averted her gaze. She observed. She saw the subtle tremor in Helen Grayson's hand as she lifted her teacup, the flicker of contempt in her eyes as she watched her husband. She saw the other staff members whispering in corners, their loyalty as fragile as the porcelain they polished. And she watched Edward. He had finally emerged from his self-imposed exile, his presence once again dominating every room he entered. But he too was changed. His bombastic arrogance was gone, replaced by a watchful, serpentine stillness. He was a man who knew he had been wounded and was now sniffing the air for the scent of his attacker. His eyes would sweep over the staff, over his wife, over his son, searching for the source of the shift he could feel in his own home. And his eyes began to settle on Laura. He noticed the absence of her fear. He saw that the woman who once shrank from his gaze now met it with a disconcerting calm. He saw not submission, but a quiet, unbreakable strength. It infuriated him. He had broken her once, publicly, and yet she refused to stay broken. This subtle defiance was a challenge he could not abide. For Laura, the discovery in the ledger was only the beginning. Each night she would retrieve the book, and by the faint light of her phone, she would study its contents. The name from her past was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern. There were other names, other dates, other cryptic notes. A journalist who had been investigating one of Edward's companies, suddenly silenced by a career-ending scandal. A small business owner who had refused to sell his property for a new development, mysteriously ruined by a series of fabricated health code violations. It was all there, a meticulous chronicle of lives systematically dismantled for profit. Her own tragedy was not unique. It was just a single line item in a long and brutal accounting of one man's greed. The problem was so much bigger than her. It was a web of corruption and cruelty, and Edward Grayson sat at its very center, a monstrous spider pulling the strings. The confrontation came on a Tuesday afternoon. He cornered her in the narrow hallway that led to the West Wing, a space with no windows and no escape. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply blocked her path, his large frame consuming all the light and air. His voice was a low, venomous purr. He told her he had noticed the change in her, that her resilience was admirable, but misplaced. He took a step closer, invading her personal space, his cologne cloying and suffocating. Laura's heart hammered, but she held his gaze, refusing to look away. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He said he understood the importance of motivation, of having something to protect, and then he delivered the blow, precise and devastating. He mentioned her daughter by name. He spoke of the prestigious private school she attended, the one Laura worked 3 jobs to afford. He mused aloud about how unfortunate it would be if the school's anonymous benefactor, the one who funded the scholarship program for promising students, were to suddenly face unforeseen financial difficulties. He wasn't just threatening her job. He was threatening her child's future. He was threatening the one pure, good thing in her entire world. Laura stood frozen in the dim hallway, the cold reality of his power washing over her. She had his secret in her hand, but he had her heart in his. What good was the truth if revealing it meant destroying the very person she was fighting for? Edward's threat landed with the force of a physical blow. The air in the hallway seemed to solidify, trapping Laura in a suffocating prison of her own powerlessness. The ledger, her supposed key to justice, now felt like a block of lead in its hiding place, capable only of pulling her and her daughter down into an abyss. She had wildly underestimated her opponent. She had armed herself with facts and truths, while he fought with a far more potent weapon, her love for her child. In the days that followed, a chilling despair began to seep into her resolve. She performed her duties on autopilot, her body moving through the familiar motions of cleaning and serving, while her mind replayed Edward's words, his cruel, knowing smile. The mansion, which she had started to see as a battlefield, reverted to being a cage, and she its helpless prisoner. The change did not go unnoticed by her small, silent guardian. Daniel, with the acute sensitivity of a child living in a war zone, sensed the shift in her immediately. The quiet strength she had projected was gone, replaced by a brittle, haunted fragility. He began to shadow her more closely, his presence a constant worried question. One afternoon, as she was polishing the silver in the pantry, her hands moving mechanically, he tugged gently on her sleeve. He said nothing but led her through a side door and into the vast manicured gardens. He walked past the perfect rose bushes and the manicured lawns, leading her to a forgotten corner of the estate, where a massive ancient willow tree drooped its branches to the ground, creating a hidden green room. Inside this secluded sanctuary, there was a small, worn patch of grass. It was clearly his refuge. He sat down, patting the ground beside him. For a long time they sat in silence, the gentle rustling of the willow leaves the only sound. Then in a small voice he confessed his own secret. He told her this was where he came, when his father's yelling grew too loud. He told her about the time, years ago, when he had accidentally broken an expensive vase, and his father had locked him in his room for an entire day, taking away all his books. He hadn't cried from the punishment, he said, but from the crushing silence, the feeling of being utterly alone. It was then that Laura understood the true depth of their bond. He wasn't just protecting her from his father. He was protecting her from the same profound loneliness that haunted his own young life. In his confession, she saw her own vulnerability mirrored back at her. The weight of Edward's threat was crushing, but the thought of failing this lonely, courageous boy was unbearable. In that quiet, green space, her despair did not vanish, but it was joined by a fierce, renewed determination. She was fighting for 2 children now. That evening, a new encounter took place. As Laura carried a tray of fresh linens down the main corridor, Helen Grayson emerged from her suite, moving with her usual ethereal grace. She fell into step beside Laura, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. She had seen Laura's spirit falter, she said, and she understood why. She knew her husband's methods. He did not break things. He found the cracks and slowly, methodically, pulled them apart. Laura stiffened, expecting another veiled command. But instead, Helen's facade of cool composure seemed to fracture for just a moment. She stopped walking and turned to face Laura, her eyes for the first time losing their icy distance and revealing a flicker of something raw and desperate. Helen confessed that she too was a prisoner. She revealed that years ago, early in their marriage, she had tried to leave him. In response, Edward had not used threats or violence. He had calmly and systematically ruined her father, a proud man with a small, honest business, using the same tactics of fabricated scandals and financial warfare that Laura had seen in the ledger. He had left her family with nothing, ensuring her complete and utter dependence on him. He owned her, she whispered, not with chains, but with the guilt and responsibility for her family's ruin. The key she had given Laura was not an act of altruism. It was an act of desperation. It was a weapon she was too terrified to wield herself. The plot twist was not that Helen was a secret ally, but that she was a fellow captive, one who had been playing a much longer, more hopeless game. Laura looked at the beautiful, impeccably dressed woman before her and saw not a queen, but a ghost, haunted by a past she could never escape. This shared vulnerability created a fragile, dangerous bridge between them. But as Helen finished her story, she pressed a folded piece of paper into Laura's hand. It wasn't an apology or a plea for forgiveness. It was another command, a new piece for the chessboard. Her face was once again a mask of cold strategy. What had she just been given? The folded piece of paper in Laura's hand was a declaration of war, and she was its unwilling soldier. Helen Grayson's message was not a suggestion. It was a cold, calculated command that defied all logic. It contained no new information, no address for a secret meeting, no name of a hidden ally. It consisted of 2 stark, terrifying words. Return it. The instruction was insane. To take the one piece of leverage she possessed, the ledger that proved Edward's monstrous criminality, and place it back into the heart of his fortress, seemed like an act of absolute surrender. Laura's mind reeled. Was this a trap? Was Helen in a desperate bid to save herself, sacrificing Laura to appease her husband? The thought was a venomous serpent, coiling in her gut. To trust Helen was to step off a cliff in complete darkness, guided only by the whisper of another prisoner. To refuse was to remain trapped, with a bomb she could not detonate without incinerating her own daughter's future. For 2 days, she was tormented. Every time Daniel looked at her with his unwavering, trusting eyes, the weight of her indecision grew heavier. He had sacrificed his relationship with his father for her, for the truth. How could she willingly give up the very proof of that truth? But every time she caught a glimpse of Edward's watchful, suspicious gaze, she felt the walls closing in. He was hunting. He knew something was amiss, and it was only a matter of time before he tore the house apart, and her with it, to find it. Finally, her choice was made not by logic, but by a desperate intuition. She would trust the ghost in the silk dress. She would trust that Helen's decades of silent observation had given her an insight into her husband's mind that Laura could never possess. It was a gamble of terrifying proportions. That night she once again became a shadow. With the ledger clutched to her chest, She slipped through the sleeping house and into the lion's den. Her hands were slick with sweat as she retrieved the fake book from the shelf, her movements clumsy with fear. She opened the hollowed-out compartment, took one last look at the spidery script inside the real ledger, the evidence of so much pain, and placed it back into its velvet-lined tomb. As she slid the book back into its place among the identical volumes, a profound sense of loss washed over her. She had just disarmed herself completely. She felt naked, vulnerable, a fool who had just handed her only shield back to the enemy. Turning to leave, her heart sinking with the weight of her choice, her eyes fell upon the doorway. And there, standing in the shadows of the hall, was Daniel. He wasn't angry, he wasn't crying. His expression was something far worse. It was a look of quiet, absolute devastation. His small face, which had so often looked at her with pure, unadulterated trust, was now a mask of confusion and profound hurt. He had seen it all. He had seen her sneak in, not to find more evidence, but to return the one weapon they had. In his world of black and white, of heroes and villains, what he had just witnessed was an unforgivable act of betrayal. She had surrendered. She had chosen his father's side. Laura opened her mouth to speak, to explain a choice she barely understood herself, but no words came out. Daniel just shook his head, a single, slow, heartbreaking gesture, and then turned and vanished back into the darkness, the sound of his soft footsteps a death knell for the bond they had shared. The following afternoon, Edward summoned her to the study. He was standing by the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the very picture of smug triumph. He didn't even turn to look at her. He spoke to her reflection in the dark glass. He informed her that he knew she had taken the ledger. A tiny, almost invisible fiber, placed on the spine of the book, had been disturbed. He had been waiting, he gloated, to see what the little mouse would do with a morsel of power. Her returning it was the most pathetic, predictable ending he could have imagined. He finally turned, his eyes gleaming with victory. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken her. And in that moment, as his arrogance washed over her, the true nature of Helen's plan crashed into Laura's mind with the force of a tidal wave. This was never about surrender. Helen knew he would be watching. She knew he would see the book returned. The entire act was a piece of theater, a calculated sacrifice designed to make him believe exactly this, that the threat was contained, that he had won. Helen had not told Laura to retreat. She had ordered her to be the bait in a much larger trap. Just as this stunning realization settled, a sharp buzz emanated from the phone on Edward's desk. He glanced at it, an irritated flick of his eyes. The smug expression on his face instantly dissolved, replaced by a ghastly, ashen horror. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind the same sickly pallor she had seen in the kitchen. He stared at the screen, then slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking onto hers. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something she had never seen there before. Pure, unadulterated fear. His voice was a strangled whisper, a sound completely alien to him. He took a stumbling step toward her, his hand outstretched, not in anger, but in a desperate plea for information. "The shipping manifests," he croaked, his voice cracking. "What did you do with the real ones?" Edward Grayson's world narrowed to the glowing screen of his phone, and the face of the woman standing before him. The carefully constructed universe of his own making was imploding in real time. The question he had choked out, "What did you do with the real ones?" was not an accusation. It was the desperate plea of a drowning man. In that moment, Laura saw past the monster to the pathetic, terrified core he had hidden for so long, and she felt nothing. No pity, no fear, only the cold, clean focus of a mission nearing its completion. She did not answer him immediately. She let the silence stretch, letting him stew in the acid of his own panic. She finally understood Helen's genius. It was a strategy born from decades of silent, powerless observation. Helen knew her husband's fatal flaw was not his cruelty, but his arrogance. He would always look for the most obvious threat, the direct attack, while completely ignoring the danger that crept in from the periphery. Laura's inner truth, the one she had buried beneath years of servitude and sorrow, rose to the surface. She was not just a maid. She was not just a victim. She was the daughter of a watchmaker, a woman raised in a world of intricate gears and meticulous precision, where the smallest component could bring the entire machine to a halt. She was a restorer of books, a woman who understood that the most valuable secrets are often hidden not in a locked vault, but between the lines. As Edward stared at her, his composure shattering, she finally spoke, her voice calm and even, a surgeon's scalpel dissecting his empire. She explained that the folded piece of paper Helen had given her did not contain a command, but a number, a sequence of digits that corresponded not to a bank account, but to a Dewey Decimal Classification. It pointed to a specific obscure book in a forgotten corner of the vast library, a dusty volume on 18th century maritime law. While Edward had been fixated on the forged legal text, the obvious hiding place, he had completely overlooked the real one. The true secret was not hidden in a book, but was the book itself. Tucked within its brittle, yellowed pages were the documents he sought, the original unaltered shipping manifests from his import-export business. Documents that detailed not just the legal cargo he declared, but the illegal, undeclared goods that were the true source of his initial vast wealth. Weapons, contraband, laundered money. The ledger she had returned was a chronicle of his personal cruelties, a tool to destroy reputations. The manifests were the key to his entire criminal enterprise, the proof that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. His face contorted, a mask of disbelief warring with dawning horror. He stammered that it was impossible, that no one knew about those documents. But Laura continued, her voice relentless. She confessed the truth of her own past, a story she had never told a soul in this house. She told him about her husband, about the accident, and about the man whose name was in his ledger. The man, she now knew, had been one of his smugglers, a loose end that Edward had paid to silence and make disappear after the crash exposed a piece of his operation. The ledger was not just a list of victims. For her, it was a map that connected the ruin of her past to the architect of that ruin. It was the key that unlocked not a desire for vengeance, but a need for absolute justice. Her confession was not one of weakness, but of strength. It was the revelation that her presence in his house was not a coincidence. It was a reckoning, years in the making, set in motion by forces he had never bothered to understand. He took a step back, stumbling against his own desk, the master of the universe reduced to a cornered rat. The power in the room had shifted completely. It no longer resided with the man behind the mahogany desk, but with the woman in the simple black uniform. He had built his life on the belief that everyone had a price, that every loyalty could be bought, every person broken. He had never conceived of a world where a quiet maid and a silenced wife could orchestrate his downfall with nothing more than a library card number and a shared history of pain. His empire wasn't being taken from him in a boardroom coup or a stock market crash. It was being dismantled from the inside out, by the very people he had deemed invisible. He lunged for the phone on his desk, his mind racing, trying to find an escape route, a person to call, a threat to make. But before his fingers could touch the screen, a sound from downstairs froze them both. A sharp, authoritative ringing that echoed through the silent, cavernous mansion. The doorbell. Once, twice, 3 times. It was not the gentle chime of a guest. It was the insistent, unyielding summons of someone who would not be denied entry. The insistent ringing of the doorbell was a sound of judgment echoing from another world. For Edward, it was the tolling of a bell announcing his own execution. For Laura, it was the sound of the cavalry arriving. The final, decisive move in a chess game orchestrated by a silent queen. The plan, in its elegant and brutal simplicity, was now clear. Returning the first ledger was not a retreat. It was a strategic misdirection. It was designed to feed Edward's colossal ego, to make him believe he had outsmarted his meek, clumsy maid. While he was gloating over his perceived victory, Helen, armed with the knowledge of his confirmed arrogance, made the call. She had set the stage, and Laura's confession had been the cue for the curtain to rise on the final act. Downstairs, the muffled sounds of the front door opening were followed by the housekeeper's panicked, high-pitched voice, quickly silenced by a low, authoritative murmur. Heavy, purposeful footsteps began to ascend the grand staircase. Not the hesitant steps of a guest, but the confident, measured tread of men who do not need an invitation. Edward's mind, usually a whirlwind of predatory calculation, seemed to have shut down. He was a cornered animal, his eyes darting between Laura and the study door, seeing no escape. His last resort was to revert to his basest instinct, brute force. He lunged, not at Laura, but towards the heavy bronze statue on his mantelpiece, the same one he had thrown in his rage weeks before. His intention was clear. If he was going down, he would create chaos, perhaps take her with him. But he never made it. The ornate brass doorknob began to turn. This was it, the moment of confrontation. Laura braced herself, ready to face the authorities, to tell her story, to present the evidence that would finally bring this monster to justice. The door swung open. But it was not the grim, uniformed figures she expected who entered first. It was Daniel, a small, frantic blur of motion. He slipped into the room just ahead of the two agents who followed him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a desperate, terrified energy. He had seen the official cars on the long, winding driveway. He had seen the men with badges. And his child's mind, poisoned by the sight of Laura returning the ledger, had leaped to a catastrophic conclusion. She had betrayed them all, and now these men were here to punish his father for a crime she had failed to prove. He did not run to his father. He did not run to Laura. He ran straight to the bookshelf, to the third row, to the forged volume of 19th century legal texts. His small hands, fumbling with panic, pulled the book box from the shelf and wrenched it open, revealing the original ledger inside. The agents stopped in the doorway, their professional composure momentarily disrupted by the strange, frantic actions of the boy. Edward, who a second ago had been ready to resort to violence, froze, a glimmer of wild, desperate hope igniting in his eyes. He saw what was happening. He saw an escape route opening, a path paved by his own son's broken heart. Daniel turned, holding the ledger aloft like a sacred relic. His tear-filled eyes were fixed on the lead agent, a tall man with a grim, unreadable face. The boy's voice, when it came out, was a high-pitched, trembling cry of misplaced loyalty and profound pain. It wasn't him. It was her, he shouted, his small finger pointing directly at Laura. She's been lying. I saw her. She snuck in here last night and she put this book on the shelf. She's trying to frame my dad. The accusation, so pure in its conviction, so devastating in its timing, sucked all the air out of the room. Laura's perfectly executed plan, the culmination of years of suffering and weeks of strategy, shattered. It was her word, the word of a maid against the passionate, tearful testimony of a 10-year-old boy defending his father. The lead agent's gaze shifted from the hysterical child to the suddenly hopeful father, and finally settled on Laura, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and confusion. He took a deliberate step into the room, his voice a low, sharp command that demanded an immediate answer. "Ma'am," he said, the word cutting through the tension like a shard of glass. "What is the meaning of this?" The agent's question was a physical thing, a block of ice in the center of the room, chilling everyone to the bone. Laura stood at the epicenter of a perfect storm, a child's heartbroken betrayal, a villain's last gasp hope, and the cold, impartial suspicion of the law. Daniel's small body trembled with the force of his conviction, his finger still pointing at her, an unwavering accusation. Edward's face was a canvas of burgeoning triumph. He could see his salvation in his son's misguided loyalty. He leaned back ever so slightly, a silent actor allowing the drama to unfold in his favor, confident that the maid would crumble under the weight of a child's tears. He was wrong. In that moment of supreme pressure, Laura's strength of character, forged in years of silent endurance, came into sharp, brilliant focus. She did not look at the agents. She did not look at Edward. She looked only at Daniel. She took a single, deliberate step towards him, her hands open and visible, a gesture of peace in a room on the brink of war. Her voice, when she spoke, was not defensive or angry. It was quiet, filled with a profound and aching tenderness that cut through the boy's fear. She told him that he was right. She acknowledged his truth, validating the evidence of his own eyes. She affirmed that he had seen her put the book back, that what he had witnessed looked exactly like a betrayal. She praised his bravery, his fierce, beautiful love for a father he wanted to protect. She did not dismiss his reality. She honored it. She honored him, and in doing so, she disarmed him completely. The rigid, accusatory line of his body softened. The fire in his eyes was banked by a flicker of confusion. He had expected denial, a fight. He had not expected understanding. With his trust now hanging in the balance, Laura continued. She explained, in the simple, clear terms a child could grasp, the art of the feint. She spoke of how, in stories, the hero sometimes has to pretend to be weak, to make the dragon believe it has already won. You let it see you put down your wooden sword, she explained, so that it doesn't notice the real one, the one made of steel hidden behind your back. She had not returned the ledger to surrender. She had returned it to make the dragon arrogant, to make him blind. Because his arrogance, she explained, was always his greatest weakness. She was not just explaining a strategy. She was arming him with a truth about his own father that he had always felt but never understood. Daniel's gaze shifted from Laura's earnest, pained face to his father's. He saw the flicker of triumphant cruelty there, the smug satisfaction of a man who was perfectly willing to let his own child's broken heart be his shield. And in that instant, the boy knew. The dragon was real. Laura's story was true. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in his young mind, and the devastation on his face was replaced by a look of grim, adult understanding. The agents watched, silent and transfixed, as this quiet, emotional drama unfolded. Realizing they were witnessing the true climax of the case, Daniel lowered his hand, the one holding the ledger of personal cruelties, as if it were now tainted. He turned to the lead agent, his voice no longer shrill with panic, but low and steady with a terrible certainty. He told the agent that Laura was telling the truth. There was, he said, another book. A different one, a dusty, forgotten book about old ships. That was all they needed. One agent remained with a stunned Edward while the other, guided by a now resolute Daniel, walked to the far side of the library. A moment later he returned, the innocuous volume on maritime law in his hand. He opened it, and the crisp official documents tucked inside fanned out like a deck of damning cards. The shipping manifests, the real sword. Edward Grayson did not rage. He did not protest. He simply collapsed. It was not a physical fall, but an implosion of the soul. The arrogance, the power, the sheer force of will that had defined him his entire life evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, pathetic shell of a man. The victory was absolute, achieved not through force but through an act of profound emotional intelligence that had turned his own son into the instrument of his final, undeniable ruin. The agents moved in, their actions now swift and decisive. As they placed the cuffs on his wrists, Edward seemed to see his son for the first time, not as an heir or a possession, but as a person, and the loss was so total it broke him. They began to lead him out of the room, a ghost being exorcised from his own home. This should have been the end, the moment of catharsis. But as the defeated figure of Edward Grayson was escorted past the doorway, another figure appeared, moving with silent grace. It was Helen. Her face was not triumphant or relieved. It was as serene and unreadable as ever. She watched her husband be led away without a flicker of emotion. Then she turned her cool, calculating gaze upon Laura, and then upon Daniel, who had instinctively moved to stand by Laura's side. Her next words, delivered in a calm, almost casual whisper, were not a celebration of their shared victory, but a final, devastating plot twist that redefined the entire board. "I will be leaving tonight," she said, her eyes fixed on Laura. "My father's assets have been unfrozen. I'm going home. You have done a wonderful thing for this house, Laura. Now what will you do with him?" Laura looked from the cold, legalistic words on the page to the small, hopeful face of the boy in her doorway. The photograph in his hands was a relic of a life that no longer existed, a portrait of a mother who had chosen her own freedom over her son's heart. In that moment, the impossible choice became the only choice. To walk away from him would not be freedom. It would be a betrayal of her own soul, a final hollow victory that would leave her as empty as the echoing halls of the mansion. She had not fought a monster just to abandon his most innocent victim. She looked at Daniel, at his wide, questioning eyes, and she gave him the one thing he had never truly had, an answer that was simple, unwavering, and absolute. She knelt down, not as a maid to a master's son, but as one human being to another, and she opened her arms. He didn't need to speak. He dropped the photograph and rushed into her embrace, his small body clinging to her with the desperate strength of a survivor who has finally found safe harbor. The choice was made. 2 weeks later, they walked away from the great iron gates of the Grayson estate for the last time. They did not look back. Laura carried a single worn suitcase containing her belongings. Daniel carried a small backpack with a few books and the one framed photograph he had chosen to keep. They did not look like a wealthy heir and his trustee. They looked like what they had become, a small, determined family of two, leaving a battlefield behind. They moved into a modest, sunlit apartment in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood 2 towns over, a world away from the cold opulence of Greenwich. The name Grayson was left behind like a shed skin. Here they were just Laura and Daniel. Their new life was built not on grand gestures, but on the small, quiet moments of ordinary peace. The smell of pancakes in the morning, the shared laughter over a funny line in a book, the simple, profound comfort of knowing they were not alone. Laura enrolled Daniel in the local public school, a place where his name meant nothing and his character meant everything. For the first time, he made friends based not on his father's reputation, but on his own quiet kindness. He began to heal. The haunted, watchful look in his eyes was slowly replaced by the easy curiosity of a boy discovering the world. And Laura, for the first time in a decade, could breathe. The weight of survival was lifted, replaced by the simple, joyful purpose of building a home. The trust fund Helen had left was a tool, not a crutch. Laura used it wisely for their needs, while she began to rebuild her own life. She started a small online business from their spare bedroom, returning to her first love, restoring old, damaged books. Her gentle, meticulous work brought life back to forgotten stories. Her own quiet act of creating order and beauty out of chaos and decay. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after they had left the mansion, Laura was in the park, watching Daniel play soccer with his friends. His laughter, loud and uninhibited, carried on the breeze. He was no longer a small, silent shadow, but a boy filled with light. A package had arrived for her that morning, with no return address. Inside was a single leather-bound book and a short, unsigned note. The book was a rare first edition of a classic she had once mentioned loving in passing, a conversation from another lifetime. The note contained only 3 words: "Thank you, H." It was not an apology. It was not a plea for connection. It was an acknowledgement, a final closing of a ledger from one survivor to another. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the grass, Laura thought about the winding, impossible path that had brought her here. She had walked into that house a victim, a ghost invisible to those she served. She had faced down a tyrant, not with a weapon of violence, but with the unbreakable strength of her own quiet integrity. She had won a war no one knew she was fighting, and, in the end, had been left to choose the nature of her own victory. Her victory was not in the destruction of a powerful man, nor in the inheritance of his wealth. It was here, in the sound of a child's unfettered laughter. It was in the profound, unshakable truth that real power is not the ability to control others, but the courage to care for them, especially when they have been left with nothing. For in the end, the grandest mansions and the most formidable empires are built on foundations of sand, destined to crumble. But a life built on a single, selfless act of kindness, that is a fortress that can withstand any storm. A legacy that will echo long after the names of tyrants have been turned to dust. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you won't miss a single one of our emotional journeys. And we would love to know where you watched from today. Let us know the name of your city in the comments, so we can see how far our stories travel. Thank you for being part of our community.